Welcome in my session, Harness the Power of Open Source Databases on Azure, or in other words, explaining you what it takes to run MySQL and PostgresSQL databases as Azure Pass services. My name is Peter Tander. I'm the CEO and lead technical trainer at PDTIT and 007 FFF Learning, a company that I founded about 9 years ago. And I'll be the one presenting this workshop today. The key goal of my business is providing Microsoft technology workshops to larger Microsoft partners, larger Microsoft customers, and Microsoft internal teams. Initially started with Microsoft infrastructure, where Exchange was my core technology for pretty much 15 years. But about 5 years ago, I decided to go total cloud and focusing on Azure and only on Azure. When I'm not delivering training somewhere in the world, I'm writing courseware, creating lab guides, or writing technical books, and obviously always with an Azure subject in mind. Feel free to connect on social media, where if you should have any questions on Azure, I'm always willing to help you and provide feedback. As part of today's session, I would like to talk about 4 main topics, starting with what it takes to leverage the open source tools and platforms of your choice. What it takes to migrate, deploy Azure database solutions, and again focusing on PostgresSQL and MySQL in this session. And then talking a little bit about securing and monitoring those open source databases running in Azure Pass, and eventually ending the session with a couple of words around how you can actually migrate your databases. Now, I shared from the title slide, I'm going to talk about innovations that happened in open source database spaces, namely MySQL Server and PostgresSQL on the Azure Pass platform. So quite important, I'm not talking about deploying virtual machines and installing MySQL or PostgresSQL inside a VM. It's all about using the Azure platform services. Now, when we look at how popular open source databases are today, there are a couple of different ones. You got obviously MySQL, it's been around for quite some years now. PostgresSQL, pretty important one, but also a couple of other database flavors, MongoDB, CosmosDB, Cassandra, MariaDB, and most probably a lot of other ones. So a lot of those database solutions are actually pretty popular, partly because they're a lot cheaper than the full-blown, I would say, Microsoft SQL Server or the Oracle counterpart. But next to that, it's also because they have a lightweight model, meaning not really requiring a lot of database compute power. And obviously, this all depends on the actual use case. I have customers that are actually using MySQL databases that are actually using pretty powerful servers. Now let's go through some facts and figures later on in this presentation, what makes open source databases interesting for your environment. Now when we map it with the Microsoft solutions, then again everybody really knows SQL Server, where if you look at the Azure platform, besides running a SQL virtual machine, you can obviously also run a SQL Pass based solution. On top of running a SQL database, you have SQL Data Warehouse, SQL Data Factory, or Azure Data Factory, I should say, where you can migrate data, import, export data, even transform data from different data sources into a SQL database or the other way around. And then again, I'm talking about open source databases, MySQL and Postgres, where there's actually a small mistake in the slide I'm seeing right now, where obviously it's not in preview anymore. It's totally out of preview, fully supported, high available, everything is being covered. Now next to that, the other interesting aspect is that it's running as a platform as a service or PaaS offering, which means you can run this in Azure data centers. On top of the Azure data center, you build underlying Azure storage, you can use Azure Compute, but again, since we're using PaaS, we're not deploying any virtual machines. And then on top of that, we're gonna focus on the actual database services layer, where again, For MySQL and PostgresSQL, we have built-in high availability, disaster recovery. You can use backup restore operations, not only for disaster recovery purposes, but also running it as a migration tool if you want. Using the cloud scale, using governance, and obviously tuning, monitoring, and everything else you need to make this a full-blown professional running database solution. And I'll cover some of those in one of my demos. So from a high-level perspective, again, there's a fine difference, obviously, from the database perspective between MySQL and PostgresSQL. But from an Azure Pass perspective, both flavors are pretty complete and pretty similar in offering. So whenever I'm talking about MySQL or Postgres, it's always valid for any of those two flavors. Now, from the high level, and I know this might sound a little bit like a marketing slide, but it's fully managed. Next to that, you can scale within seconds. Obviously, really using cloud and the cloud platform, if you want, as one of the key characteristics. Whenever your demand is going up, you can easily, and in most cases even in an automatic way, using auto-scaling functionality. When more users are coming in, where more performance requirements are kicking into your database engine, you can allow Azure to automatically scale your database power. And obviously you can do it in two ways, where at the end of the week or when your workload is not in demand anymore, it will scale down as well. High availability, already mentioned, is part of the default solutioning. So in any flavor you deploy of SQL, MySQL and PostgresSQL, it's providing you high availability out of the box. And obviously high availability is an important factor for migrating your database to an Azure-based solution. So you can really trust Azure to keep your enterprise applications up and running. Azure as a cloud platform is built to deliver high availability, but on top of that, it requires no extra configuration. Replication or cost is ensured to make sure that your applications are always running whenever you need them. And then the last one is simple and flexible pricing, and I'll have one slide on pricing later on, where you can decide between three different flavors, a basic one, a standard one, and a premium one, where depending a bit on your requirements from the business, performance, database size, you can actually choose or even easily migrate from one plan to the other. And then lastly, security is also an interesting one, and maybe even more critical than all the other topics that I already mentioned, where Azure services allow you to run your applications on top of the Azure platform again, where Azure for now is one of the most trusted clouds available. And again, out of a fully integrated service, Azure Database for MySQL and PostgresSQL plugs into the Microsoft global network of data centers, providing unparalleled security and monitoring as part of the solution. Now, a lot of benefits you can get from using MySQL and PostgresSQL, because again, it's offered as a full managed service, which means you don't need to do any sort of patching of the underlying server. You're not managing the virtual machines. This is being cared of by Microsoft. There's no real need to take any backups. It's again an automatic backup integrated feature, which is allowing you to restore data up to 35 days retention. And you can obviously extend that retention where needed. As far as security is concerned, your entire database server, but again, the underlying VM is not managed by you. It is managed by Microsoft, but that will also give you enterprise-grade security and compliance built in. Tracking performance and a lot of different activities of your server is also possible. Integration with, for example, Log Analytics as the go-to monitoring tool, which provides you detailed insights during 30 days as a free service. So just imagine that all these capabilities require almost no administration and provided at no additional cost. They allow you to focus on rapid application development, accelerating your time to market, rather than allocating precious time doing system updates, system management, and not really always focusing on the actual database. So drilling down a bit more, like any other PAAS database service, like SQL Server if you want, MySQL and PostgresSQL both work within the logical server concept. You start from creating a database within your Azure subscription. This service provides a namespace for the database that links as a container to your database solution. It also provides the connection endpoint for your server in a database access perspective, from like managing the database as a DBA, but also out of your applications. Where on top of that, you can set policies, define firewall rules, and defining user and configurations for any of those databases. And obviously the question comes up, what are the different ways to actually create a database, connecting to it and managing it? Where Azure as the overall platform gives you a couple of different options. A first option is obviously using the Azure portal. One of my first demos in the upcoming minute is deploying an Azure MySQL database. Next to that, you can also use PowerShell, the Azure CLI command line tool, integrating from within your application, and lastly, using your trusted, I would say, common database tools like the MySQL Workbench tool or the PG admin for managing your Postgres database. So let me start with showing you in a first demo what it takes to deploy a MySQL database in my Azure subscription. So from my Azure portal, it's pretty easy if you're a little bit familiar with the Azure portal already, out of creating web applications, virtual machines, or any other resource in Azure, then deploying a MySQL database shouldn't all be that hard. So starting from the create a resource, I can go to my database options in the Azure Marketplace, where I can select the database that I want to deploy. And as mentioned earlier, some of those databases are in preview, like the MariaDB, but the ones I'm talking about in this session, MySQL and Postgres, are again already available for quite some months outside of preview. Other solutions that you might be familiar with are Cosmos DB, where again we're not running a virtual machine, or on top of the list here, we can deploy a SQL managed instance or a SQL database, and again all these are offered as PAAS services. So selecting my first option here, the Azure database for MySQL, which is like the full name, what it's going to do is asking me for a SQL server name. And again, although they're talking about a MySQL server, it's not really deploying any virtual machines. It's creating an instance where you're just focusing on the instance, but not using the underlying virtual machine itself. So I'm going to invent the name. This could be MVPDays MySQL, super original, but not that important. Linking to my Azure subscription, and for now keeping it easy, creating a new resource group. I can define if I want to use a blank database or immediately integrating with a backup, where it will allow me during the initial or after the initial provisioning to actually restore from, for example, an on-prem running backup solution. So I'm going to create a blank database for now, and the next thing it needs is my admin credentials. So I'm just going to provide an username, and as you can see, it requires a complex password as well. There we go. I can define my location, any of the Azure regions where MySQL or PostgreSQL should be available in most regions. I haven't really checked on the details if it's available in all 50 regions. In my slide I had 38, which I think is a good average. So if you're really wondering for any specific region, if it's available, then you can obviously consult the Azure documentation. Next to that, another important aspect of my PAAS service is that Microsoft actually defines the version of the backend. So for now, they're offering 5.7 and 5.6, like it's one version backwards compatible. But if you're still running, I don't know, like a 5.0 database version on-prem, and you want to perform a migration, then know that the MySQL flavor is always the latest or the pre-latest one. And then the other aspect that I'll talk about a little bit later on is pricing, where it's helping you a little bit in pinpointing what pricing schema you need to select based on the virtual cores, based on memory consumption, or based on the database size. And next to that, as you can see down here at the right hand side, if I'm going to allocate more cores, then all of a sudden it could become a somehow more expensive layer, or if my database is growing, then my pricing will also change a little bit. So I'm okay with the default settings for now, and that's pretty much what it takes to actually get my database created. My deployment kicks off. Everything else is just typical Azure deployment, so I could follow my deployment progress, where it's going to provide me some updates, and obviously here, once my database is up and running, I can connect to it. I'm not going to complete my Postgres demo, but actually show you that it's the exact same thing. So from my marketplace, I select PostgresSQL version here, asking me again server name, a resource group, an admin account, password, location, and versioning again. So it's all pretty similar. So with that, I'm moving on, and to make sure I'm not really running out of time and not making it too boring for you guys, just again know that MySQL or PostgresSQL is the exact same deployment. You could also use PowerShell CLI, where the syntax is pretty similar for any of those two database flavors. So while my deployment is ongoing, let me share a few words around the pricing tier. So the service provides predictable performance, where you can use inclusive pay-as-you-go pricing. You can choose between the pricing tier, the compute unit, and the storage, like the amount of disk space that you're going to need for your database flavor. Where you can start with, like in my example, I started with the basic one, where I don't really need all the performance of the Azure cloud. And then later on, I can move to a standard or premium one. Now, if you look at any of those details, it's always coming back to a counter known as the Azure Compute Unit, where a compute unit is a measure of CPU processing throughput available to your database server. So when you move up from like basic to standard, a basic gives you, for example, 50 compute units, where they actually equate to a half core. 100 compute units would equate to one full core. And that's how you can choose and decide on what performance requirements you have. So let me check back if my database is already deployed. Looks like it's still ongoing, but let me already move up to my resource groups. And it's obviously not showing anything yet. I was just hoping that it was already finished, not that Azure would be slow. Maybe I'm just a little bit hesitant. So let me move on with my talk, and I'll come back to this one later on, where I can talk about some additional platform features. So one of the integrations you have once your MySQL or PostgresSQL is up and running, you can use some additional built-in platform features. So for example, updating the database admin password. In your on-premises or local running MySQL database server, if you have full admin control of the virtual machine or the physical server, it is pretty easy to change the password. Now, since you're not logging on to the MySQL or PostgresSQL Server VM itself, it is running as a PAAS component, don't forget about it. You need another mechanism, and that's what the update database admin password feature is doing. Next to that, you can define firewall configurations, which honestly is a pretty important feature. Because by default, although MySQL in Azure is running as a public cloud service, no connectivity is allowed to the database, unless you explicitly configure this. And then lastly, depending a bit on your application requirements, but configuring or deploying a typical MySQL or PostgresSQL server setup involves defining a lot of different parameters, really customizing, tailoring your application needs and wants. So obviously, again, since you don't have access to like the underlying database ini files, the config files, Azure for MySQL and PostgresSQL is giving you the same flexibility and options. So you can, for example, change the character set server settings, the InnoDB settings, and whatnot. Where I have a placeholder for another demo, but let me check if it's actually up and running right now. It's not there yet, but still showing you that everything is still running. And again, it's only been like not even 5 minutes, close to 5 minutes now. But again, think back about what this would look like in a full on-prem environment. It's involving deploying the virtual machine, deciding on the operating system, Windows or Linux. You need to deploy the VM. It needs to be fully patched, integrated in your network, providing admin accounts, all that stuff. Where here it's just deploying the database as a service. And again, obviously it doesn't run without any virtual machine, but you're not managing the virtual machine instance. Now in meantime, luckily my deployment is done. And that allows me to walk through some of the settings that I actually talked about for now. So one of the first ones is my server name. So that's the name I defined earlier during the initial configuration. I can check my server admin account and my version and the underlying performance configuration. From here, I can update some connection settings, what I just talked about in my previous slide, where for now, if I would want to connect to my database, it wouldn't work. So if I open up my MySQL Workbench, or again the PG admin if you use any Postgres database flavor, then I can add a new connection, and going back to my database server instance, and I can just copy that information from here. There we go. So this is my server name, and using the same in the host name option here. Port is pretty standard, although you could change it. My username is this one, and why not storing it locally, providing my complex password. Now when I test my connection, it's going to tell me that it's actually not working. And why not? Again, it's because there's a built-in security firewalling mechanism, where for here I can easily add my public client IP, and I'm going to save it for now. But next to that, as you can see here, I can add existing Azure VNets, where again an Azure VNet could be an in Azure running virtual network, where you, for example, have your VMs running. But if you have site-to-site VPN or ExpressRoute, that would also allow you a hybrid connection. So let me try this connection again, where you can see this time I'm actually successfully connected. And obviously I'm going to establish my connection from here. And if you're familiar with MySQL Workbench as the management tool, then you got all the functions, flavors, features available as your database would run locally or running in an on-prem virtual machine environment. Connection strings are there. Obviously, if you need to connect to your application in a couple of different ways, depending on your application flavor, then you can just reuse your connection string from here. And lastly, the server parameters I was talking about, where you would normally go back to your server and making all these changes locally. You can go through this list where most of the typical needed settings are actually built in, like all those initiating InnoDB settings, where if you're a SQL DBA or from an application perspective, you're probably pretty familiar with it. And then lastly, the pricing tier, I already talked about it, but nothing blocks you here from changing any settings in there. So all pretty obvious to use. So with that, again, using the typical tools, and I already showed you in my demo, where you can use the MySQL tools. Postgres would be the same, but I'm not having any Postgres deployed. But again, keep in mind that it's actually pretty similar. Even out of the built-in Azure Cloud Shell, you could use command line integration where you don't even need the full SQL Workbench or any of the other MySQL tools. Which brings me to another topic, monitoring and alerts. Monitoring is obviously pretty important, and again, out of a services perspective, MySQL, PostgresSQL are fully integrating with Azure built-in monitoring solutions. So for example, allowing you to track the performance, getting any notifications whenever something's wrong, configuring automatic actions like moving to a larger or smaller pricing plan, and if you want, integrating with more advanced analytics or reporting, but that would require an integration with Azure Monitor and Azure Log Analytics. So some examples of the metrics that you have available: CPU, compute, memory percentage, and so on. So all this is pretty out of the box, where again, full integration with other Azure monitoring tools, giving you per minute updates. And as long as you are fine with the retention of 30 days, then you can use it as a free service. Moving on to alerts, where again, it's all relying on the built-in Azure functionalities, defining email notifications, sending email to additional email addresses, like not just the Azure admins, but also your MySQL DBAs. And for defining any actions, you could also extend it and calling webhooks or runbooks. So let me show you in the portal what this actually means. So from my Azure portal again here, you can already see I have my built-in monitoring graphics available. I can see the amount of databases I'm running, and more down here in my alert section, I can define what information I want to get out of it. So for example, creating a new alert rule, just gonna create a pretty basic one. So for this specific MVPDays MySQL database, I'm gonna create an alert where if CPU, for example, where it's going to read out information. So I can define if my CPU is larger than 5%, not making it super exciting, but during 5 minutes, then the next step is what you want to get out of it. So this would be warn 5% CPU spike. With a description, could be the same, warn 5% CPU spike, and I'm afraid here no spaces are allowed. Let me quickly check. There we go. So we're gonna shorten this a little bit, just showing you the capabilities. I mean, it's not that important. Warn 5, that's better. Severity, that's all fine. And lastly, you can define how you want your notifications to be sent, which could be by email. Let me create a new group first. So this is MySQL alerts, short name, same. And the action name is email. The action type would be email, but what I mentioned, you could use an Azure function, a logic app to build automation, integrating with a webhook, integrating with any of the Azure supported ITSM tools like ServiceNow, or using a runbook. And since I configured email, let's send it to myself. super easy. This would be like an alias group, for example. Integrating with text messaging, all that is pretty obvious. There we go. So this means if I'm spiking my CPU, and obviously 5% is not really spiking, but nevertheless, it's gonna send me an alert, and I could reuse that alert for integrating with my Azure overall monitoring solution or any other monitoring tool I already have. The other topic I quickly wanted to talk about is high availability and scalability. The cool thing is that obviously it is super critical because most production environments actually demand high availability and scalability. So you can easily make changes out of your Azure MySQL or Postgres database. And whenever something goes wrong, as already mentioned in the introduction, you have built-in high availability. So you as a DBA, you as an Azure admin, you don't have to do anything. It's literally flipping over and redirecting your connection. So if you look at it from, I would say, a diagram perspective, your application connects to a built-in gateway. It is there, but you don't have to deploy it. It's part of the PAAS layer. And then you're going to deploy multiple instances. And again, it's part of the platform. You don't have to build any high availability or scalability whatsoever. So you're going to deploy a SQL, MySQL, or again, Postgres gives you the exact same functionality. And eventually your database is obviously stored in Azure Storage. And whenever something goes wrong, like the underlying virtual machine node or the SQL instance, MySQL instance would fail, or something goes wrong with the scaling, then the system is going to redirect to a new node instance that's already available and waiting for you to be attached. And it's really that easy. So let me show you what this looks like before moving over to the last section. So, come on. If I go back to my database settings, there's a replication section here where if you want any additional high availability, it's already part of your Azure region. So everything I showed you is the regional high availability. But if you want to make sure that your database is high available whenever your Azure region should become unavailable, what it actually involves is deploying a second MySQL server, and it's going to create a replica, copying all the database information and making sure that the database is consistent. And once you have the two databases up and running, you can easily perform a failover in a manual way or in a more automated way whenever Azure detects that something's wrong. Integrating again with a runbook, for example, would be the way out there. So moving on and sharing some highlights around security. As mentioned in the introduction, security is pretty important. And what MySQL and PostgresSQL is giving you is security on all aspects of the platform. So your data access already showed you the firewall rules, and the default connection is also encrypted using SSL. Identity is part of the game, so from the initial deployment on, you need to provide an authentication admin account, which means if you don't have the exact user account settings, you cannot connect to the database. And next to that, you can protect your data, where by default, the data at rest is supported in an encrypted way. So you can secure the data using built-in encryption. So what this looks like from a connectivity perspective is the integration with firewalls, like I already showed you in my demo, where you can define which Azure VNets can connect to the database, or from the outside, like in my example here, what would be the client VM, the public IP addresses that can actually establish a connection to the underlying databases. Where the next topic is the migration. And as mentioned already, again, during the introduction, you have a couple of options. The first option is using import-export, where you just deploy your database in Azure, and from there running an export, moving to another database running an import, or the other option out of your MySQL or Postgres PG admin trusted tool performing a dump and restore. So what you need to perform this is, first of all, having your database up and running. Next to that, installing the MySQL dump command line tool, connecting to MySQL Workbench or any of the other MySQL admin tools, and performing the dump and restore from there. And I'm pretty sure that if you're a MySQL or Postgres DBA admin today, you're super familiar with any of those steps. And what I want to highlight here is that your way of managing, migrating, performing the backup restore, nothing is changing when you're communicating with an Azure database for MySQL or the Azure database for Postgres. So you start with the database dumps. When you're migrating, you could also define settings, maybe even moving to a larger performance plan for actually speeding up the migration, and lastly, moving back to a smaller database plan once your database is running. So one last part of my demo, I could actually try and add a replica here, why not? Second MySQL, I could actually done that before, but not super important. But from here, so out of, I would say, my database root settings, I can perform a restore. I don't have any backups configured for now, but obviously I assume that you're somehow understanding what I mean. If I have my backup running, then I can select my restore point here, going back any 7 days, which is like the default retention, selecting my database. It's never overriding your existing one, so you always need to restore to a new server, where this could be MySQL restore, and running it from here. And then obviously, depending a bit on the database size, database service plan, like the underlying pricing tier and performance, it might take a little bit more time, but that's all obvious since it's relying on the underlying platform. But again, key message here is the built-in capabilities. Another feature that you have available that I didn't cover in security is advanced threat protection, which is not enabled by default. And as you can see here, for roughly $15 US a month, it's going to give you built-in advanced threat protection, which means additional security built-in functionality out of your database. And I think with that, I hope I introduced you to the Azure databases for MySQL, and if you want Postgres, where again, I didn't do a lot about Postgres demos, but the look and feel capabilities are identical to what Azure database for MySQL is giving you. Feel free to reach out, peter@pdtit.be, or finding me on Twitter and sending me a message. Hope to see you again at some of my future sessions here at MVPDays, and enjoy the rest of the virtual conference day. Thank you so much, and have a nice day.